Hey there, this is Derek Murphy. I've been making a series of short clips on how to launch a book in 3 weeks up on YouTube Shorts, but it's difficult to say anything meaningful in 60 seconds or less. So I'm also going to talk about the same topics in longer videos on my main YouTube channel. I will try to keep them briefer than usual. If you've been following me for a while, I tend to talk for a very long time because it can get really complicated with all of the different things that you can do to launch a book. And in this series, I'm going to try to keep things pretty short and focused. So we've got 21 steps to go through. We've covered the first 5, but before we move on to the next 5, I want to get into book editing a little bit. In the first 5, we talked about making a product that people want to buy. And I did mention that it's important to choose what type of books you write so that they fill a market that has an active readership who wants to buy books like yours. But it's also important that your books are good. And that's where it gets really messy, because everybody thinks their books are great or their stories are great, but you know, the reader ultimately decides whether or not your book is worth paying for if they keep reading the story, if you sold them on the promise of the story enough to pay for it, but then also if you can keep them reading. So all the stuff that we mentioned is really important. The blurbs, the cover, all the book marketing, publishing stuff is critical to get them reading the book, but your book still will not succeed if you can't get any book reviews, which we're going to talk about later. And if your covers are great and your blurbs are great and you already have enough reviews, but you're still having trouble marketing your book, it could be an issue with the actual content. So I want to talk a little bit here about editing because it's a big topic. It's probably going to be the most expensive thing that you pay for. There's a lot of publishing companies out there that will have packages for like $5,000 or $10,000. But besides the book cover design and maybe the formatting, editing is probably going to be your biggest expense. And the reason is it has been very difficult to edit a book. Not only do you need to be, a flawless proofreader and be able to spot typos or grammar issues or know all of the words and all the right meanings, you also probably need to know enough about story structure to fix the things that aren't working. So when you get a book edited, there's 3 basic kinds of editing. There are the proofreading stuff, which is low cost, low value. It takes a lot of time, it's really boring, and you probably don't want to do it yourself, so you might want to outsource it. It's also really difficult to edit your own words because you wrote the book, so your brain will always fill in the words that you think are there instead of what's actually on the page. Proofreading tends to be about 1 cent per word or 2 cents per word, depending, but there are different kinds of editing. So after the proofreading, which generally is like after formatting, but if you self-publish, we usually do proofreading first anyway, and then format yourself or hire a formatter. There's probably going to be mistakes even when it's all finished. And that used to really, really bother me. There was a phrase in entrepreneurship about if you feel comfortable with your launch, then you launch too late. And the idea was you want to test out the market first by launching a product before you waste a ton of time and money fixing it and making it perfect. That bothered me because I was a perfectionist and I wanted to make sure everything was absolutely perfect. But the truth is it's very difficult. Even traditional published books who go through many rounds of editing still have some typos often when they're published. It's not the worst thing in the world to have a couple of typos, but if there are too many, it can definitely ruin the reader experience. And if people don't keep reading the story, then it's going to impact sales, or they're going to give you a negative review because of editing issues. I think there are some new developments in editing and proofreading in terms of AI software like Grammarly or ProWriting that's just a little bit better, so you don't have to go through Grammarly and click, fix this 2,000 times for grammar and punctuation mistakes. There's also some tools that will just revise or refine your language in a different style that are pretty cool. But I'm most excited for the editing tools where you can just put in a chapter or even a whole book and it will just clean the typos and the punctuation, the grammar issues. Like I said, I think it's so necessary and so boring, but it's not creative. It's not something that you need to pay a lot of money for someone to fix for you, because almost anybody can do it, which is not to say it's not important. I just think there are cheaper solutions at this point, which are going to make hiring someone just for proofreading kind of obsolete. Going up a step, there's line editing or copy editing, which are a little bit different. Generally, copy editing focuses a little bit more on the layout, the punctuation, like how it looks, the formatting and style of it all. and line editing is a little bit more about, line by line, choosing better words so that you don't have repetition, you don't have clunky run-on sentences, just kind of fixing up what you've already got and making it stronger, not by rewriting it, just by removing anything that feels, that draws you out of the narrative, anything that's like when you repeat a word 5 times in a page, or even like twice in a page, that can get annoying. It draws people out of the narrative. So you can fix those things, but it takes a lot of work to do yourself, to learn how to watch for that. Sometimes it could be worth paying someone to do that for you, but the price goes up for that kind of editing, because not only do they have to fix the typos, they have to feel comfortable, fixing up your words without fixing it too much. A lot of authors, they expect editors not to change their story too much, but if as an editor, if there's something wrong with the story, I want to try to make sure that I let authors know that it could be a problem and fix it if I can. The next phase of editing is developmental, which typically is more high-level story structure stuff, and this is why it's more expensive. Roughly 5 or 6 cents a word for developmental editing, which could be a few $1,000s to edit a book. But the idea is they will look at the whole story and they will figure out the pacing, the plotting, character motivations, anything that's an issue. They will red flag it, or they'll leave a comment. When I'm editing, I might leave, dozens of comments on every page, which adds up to hundreds or thousands of comments on a book. And it's weird for authors, because most authors finish a book and send it off to an editor and they think that it's just done and ready to publish. They're not really looking for revision. But even a developmental editor, they don't really rewrite the book for you. They're not a ghost writer. So they might do, small tweaks to change the sentence structure if they think they can make the sentence stronger, but they shouldn't be actually making story changes. Typically, we will comment on things that you should probably do, and then you have to make those changes yourself. Some types of editing packages will allow you to make the changes and then come back. So a lot of times working with an editor is a lot of back and forth as you fix things. It might take longer than you expect. If you have plans to publish, next month, finding an editor who's good enough and has availability to come in and do the editing and then have a book that's ready to go in a month is probably not really going to work out so well. The other important thing to keep in mind is that the value of your book is about the content and the story, not the lack of typos or grammatical mistakes. That's sort of like a baseline. You should, of course, be above that hurdle and have a clean manuscript, but having a clean manuscript doesn't mean your book is going to be successful if nobody enjoys reading it. So a lot of people who focus too hard on, making everything perfect, but they just haven't gotten deep enough in what makes a story successful or what makes a book successful. There are luckily tons of things that most first-time authors do wrong that are pretty easy to self-edit. I have several lists with dozens and dozens of things that are red flags as an editor. These are things that authors do wrong that I can't necessarily fix because it's a story structure or content problem. And it's not my job as an editor to fix those problems. I will point them all out, but I make the same comments in all the books that I edit because these are very, very common issues. I'm going to read through a few of them just so you're aware, but I'll also link to my bigger list of writing mistakes, because that's kind of the easiest way to learn how to self-edit, is just to read a checklist and notice where you're doing these things and what you should be doing instead. So here are 6 common issues that you probably want to fix or check before you even think about working with an editor. I would also recommend using Grammarly to at least fix all your typos and grammar mistakes. It does take a little bit of time, but when you're paying a lot of money to an editor, instead of paying them lots of money to do the easy stuff, you should do the easy stuff yourself so that the editors can focus on the high-level stuff that you can't do. Anyway, here's 6 things. Number 1, maybe the protagonist is unlikable. You do need a sympathetic character. Generally, the first chapter is about introducing the ordinary world and your characters and making your character sympathetic and likable, because they're not going to care about the action or the drama or the violence or anything else that's happening if they don't know who is involved and should we like this person. Is this a hero or the villain or whatever? And side topic, I see a lot of people start off with questions like, I want to make something new that's never been done before. I want the villain, or I want the protagonist to be the surprise villain. So by the time the book ends, the protagonist is actually the bad guy, and that's their secret twist. That's very risky to do and very hard to pull off. Same thing with I want an anti-hero. I want a really negative, dark character that everybody hates, but then he has a redemption arc at the end, or even like redeeming the villain so that at the end the villain is redeemed. It really muddies the waters of the moral conflict. And if everything is sort of morally relative and everybody gets redeemed, if you don't hate the people you hate and love the people you love, it cheapens the drama. And like I said, it's not impossible to do. There are books that have done it, but I would recommend for all authors, until you've written, 20 or 30 successful books, focus on writing a simple, crowd-pleasing book in any genre first, just to make sure you can actually do it before you try to take a big, risky, avant-garde, creative approach to book writing and maybe end up with something that nobody likes. There are reasons that people read books. It's usually not to be shocked or surprised or educated. It's almost always like a guilty pleasure for entertainment or relaxation purposes. So you can choose to write whatever type of book you want, but don't think that having a twist or a surprise or a shock and being different from what everybody else is doing is a selling feature. It's not a selling feature. All right, number 2 is maybe the pacing and progression doesn't build. You might have a lot of things that happen, but none of it holds together. There's no progression and rising stakes or rising tension. There's 2 ways to do this, and I've got big videos on all of this stuff, on intrigue and suspense especially, but one of the biggest problems is, which is another point, if you're dumping information or giving too much context, then you're answering questions before readers have questions. You need to get readers asking questions first. When they have a question, that's the intrigue and the suspense. Then you delay the satisfaction until it becomes necessary, and then you fill in that puzzle. So every piece of information that's important should be fought for. It should be noticed by its absence first. There's a lack in information that draws people in. The characters should be asking these questions too, like, what is this about? Here's the thing that we need to figure out. And then later when it happens, it's a reveal or discovery. One new piece of information that solves a story question, that's a twist. That's the end of a chapter. That's a thing they were searching for. But if you just give it to them at the beginning of the chapter, it takes away all the pacing or intrigue or suspense in your book. Pacing and progression is also about, usually you start off with low stakes and you build to your high stakes. So if you start off the first chapter with huge emotion, especially if your characters are overly emotional, if they're laughing hysterically or crying hysterically, then there's nowhere for them to go later. When things are actually really bad at the end, if they're crying again or hysterical again, we've already seen that at the beginning of the book. So there's no growth. There's no growth to the passion or the drama. You start off with low stakes, you build up to the really high stakes. Most people will hold on, they're trying to hold in their emotions and keep themselves together. Your job as the author is to show the reasonably competent person who gets pushed to a point of no return when, in a way that they have never done before, they finally break down and show their emotions. That's generally how it works. If you just show all the emotions in the beginning, then it'll be less emotional at the end. Number 3, maybe the book is full of info dumps and backstory flashbacks. So this is another tricky bit. A lot of authors spend a lot of time with their world building and they figure out their characters' important backstory. But the thing is, none of that stuff is in the beginning of the book. The info dumps and there's 2 different things, info dumps and backstory. So I'll do one at a time. Info dumps is just information that you think the reader needs to know, but the author is just putting it out there as the narrator. It just appears there. It's outside of the story. When people talk about show, don't tell, what it means is that you should be able to picture everything on a stage or on the TV screen. So if you ask yourself, what does this look like? That's the question that will help you to avoid show, don't tell. So when you're doing an info dump, what does this look like? Is this just a character reading a book? Is it a narrator just talking, like just straight information and there's no pictures at all? You always want to have a picture that you're showing readers. So your info dumps have to be delivered in the context of your characters communicating with each other. And that's tricky if you know, these characters are part of your ordinary world. They're not going to be sitting around talking about things that are happening in the ordinary world, or how the, you know, magic system works, or how the politics works, because they know all that stuff already. You have to build in a crisis or an event or something that's happening where people have maybe disagreements about it that they can argue or discuss in an interesting way while revealing some of the info dumps. But also, most of the time, the info dumps really don't matter, and it's risky to put them in the first few chapters. You want to save real world building info dump stuff until later, after you've got their attention, after they like the characters, after they like the ordinary world. Start with things moving, not with information. And then backstory flashback. So backstory flashback is typically like the main character's fatal flaw, where at the very end of the book, they are in a new situation and being pressured to a degree that they never have been pressured before, and they are forced to go back to that inciting incident in their childhood where, you know, they built this critical character flaw or fear, and they have to, in the middle of the final battle scene, there's this moment of loss where they are about to lose, everybody's counting on them, the protagonist is going to win, the villain is going to win against the protagonist, and the protagonist reaches into themselves and they finally pull out the shard of glass, they heal their fatal flaw. They were forced by pressure and by caring enough about their allies to risk everything and confront their demons for the first time ever. That's when you show the final backstory. You can add some other things earlier. You can add some little vignettes or little scenes. You can have some little thought experiments where, like, you know, he saw a thing and it reminded him of this time when he went fishing with his dad. Like, short sentences that give a little bit of a picture. What you don't want to do is jump back in time. You don't want to do a, you know, we're starting in the now and then we go a whole different chapter in the past. The problem with everything in the past is that it is resolved action. So there's no stakes or consequences, because we know that, you know, whatever happened in the past, we already know that the protagonist got through it. They resolved it. It's over. So it may be a really good scene and story, but there's no stakes. There's no real conflict. It's all fake conflict because it's resolved action. So that's a big danger of actual time jumps, which is different from a real good backstory flashback. But be aware of time jumps as well, because that's another red flag. Backstory flashbacks, you can have small little ones that show some characterization, but they should be presented in the current action with dialogue or thought, and not too much. You don't want to, for example, have a conversation between two people, and after each person says a thing, you jump into a backstory, and then the other person says a thing, you jump into another flashback, so that they're talking, but they're thinking among themselves. You always want to focus on what you can see, what's happening on stage, how does this look, what does this look like. That's got to be your guiding principle. And like I said, your backstory flashbacks for deep character reveals, for your protagonist especially, save it till the very end of the book, or at least save it until, you know, after the midpoint, when you can start to, like, the first half of the book is just building up the tension and the conflict with the intrigue and the suspense by resisting information and withholding information. After the midpoint, when readers and characters are invested in the story and how it's going to play out, that's when you want to start building deeper sympathy with all of your characters before you go into the climatic battle scenes or the high tension stuff at the end of the book. So number 4 is about head hopping or POV switching. POV is point of view. Most books are written in first person or third person, past tense, simple past tense. So you want to avoid past participles like had, gone, or something like that. And you want to avoid switching between different characters. I like first person. I would recommend for most people trying to write their first book that you also do first person, because I think it's easier. Most people are familiar with writing a journal or something like that. So you can get in the head of your main character and write in first person. The limitation of first person is you really can only see or understand what the character sees and understands. But that's actually sort of a blessing, because it means you can't give all of this extra information or backstory dumps or jump into everybody's heads all the time. So limiting yourself allows you to finish a stronger book because there are less options and you have to learn how to play within this limited rule set. However, in certain genres, third-person omniscient or third-person limited POV are also sort of common, mostly for like epic fantasy. And the difference is third-person limited will kind of show you a bird's eye view of everything that's happening, but from the outside, you won't really see. It's all show, don't tell. You won't see inside of people's heads. You won't hear what they're thinking or what they're smelling or their feelings. It's more just what everything looks like. Third-person omniscient means same thing. You can see everything, but you can also get into everybody's heads. And that's where it gets really tricky, because if you're trying to do third-person omniscient, there's a tendency to show the stuff that's happening, but also show what each character is thinking all of the time. And the reason it gets really annoying is you can sometimes have thoughts in your book. A thought is generally like one sentence that's italicized. You don't want to have like a thought that's like 10 paragraphs. And you don't want to have, you know, a dialogue where every time a character says something, it's followed by an internal monologue where they're speaking out loud and then speaking inside their head and speaking out loud back and forth. That gets really distracting, and most of the time that thinking is not necessary. So only add the extra thinking if it's a crucial piece of information that we can't get anywhere else. So people like third-person omniscient because it allows you to set the stage for like a lot of characters in a lot of different places who are all doing their own thing and then slowly come together, hopefully, eventually. The problem is, instead of trying to write one compelling story, which you can do with one main protagonist and you follow on that main protagonist, when you try to do a really big story like that, you can't really get the ball rolling. You need to build sympathy, you need to increase conflict, you need to get the story rolling with every character. If you're just jumping around, all of those stories are going to be harder to build up to the point where readers are actually invested in what's happening. So it's more difficult to do it well, and there's a lot more opportunity for readers to give up because they get bored, which is another reason I recommend, even if you're doing third person, that you stick with one story. The best story is about the protagonist who changes the most during the course of the story, who has the most to lose or who changes the most. That's usually the hero. Remarkable stories are about stories that leave marks on your characters. So you have to choose the character that's going to have the greatest character arc. You can still focus on all the other characters too, but start with that one and follow them all the way, because that's going to help you to tell a strong story without, like telling one strong story is hard enough. Trying to tell like 6 different strong stories at the same time while juggling all the different pieces, it's just a lot more work. So writing is a craft that takes a lot of time to build. You don't want to try to do the hardest thing first. You want to try to do the easier thing first to gain some experience and figure things out. You know, once you've done the easy thing one time, maybe 5 times, then you can try to do something harder, but don't always just try to do the hardest thing. Real quick, this is number 5. Maybe the author is too present in the form of an onstage narrator. So anytime the narrator or the author is saying things outside of what's happening in the story, it means all the characters are just frozen on stage. So it's like pressing pause on your drama and everybody's just standing around while you're giving a voiceover to the readers directly. It's rare that that works successfully. I know there are lots of famous books that have done that. It's definitely a thing. But again, it's more difficult to pull off really well. It sometimes works, like in the case of The Great Gatsby, if you have a fictional narrator who's telling the story and that narrator is also a character in the story, that's sort of a different thing. But it's different than you as the author not being a character in the story, but just breaking in to tell everybody to freeze while you give extra information. You want to try to avoid that as much as possible. And then number 6, maybe the emotion of violence is gratuitous. So the character motivation or escalating drama isn't there. I kind of mentioned this earlier, where you want your pacing to build. You want things to start off not slow with like nothing happening. Things should be happening immediately in the first chapter, but things should get more and more conflicted, more and more tension, more not necessarily actual violence, but the threat of potential violence and potential danger as they understand the stakes against them, which you keep building. There should be more and more pressure that forces them to react. Your character should always be forced to react. Up until the midpoint, they are reacting to plot events and story events. So what doesn't work is in the first couple of chapters, I've seen this sometimes in thrillers where maybe you can get away with it, where it's just a lot of shooting and explosions, and like maybe you just want to show that your character is really cool. And that can kind of work in a first chapter, but very quickly you want to, like you see that in Netflix, maybe there's like a 30-second action scene, but then it cuts in and says, well, actually we should go back to the beginning. The action scene is just the hook, but it doesn't finish. And that's the important part with a hook or like a preface, prologue. You don't conclude the action. It's not a complete chapter. You give half of a scene that gets the moment of maximum pain or crisis, but you don't reveal how the protagonist gets out of that. You show the critical event where the story is building. And this isn't even like the main final battle scene. This is usually the thing that happens right after the midpoint. It's like the second battle. Before you go in towards the final battle scene, it's like the first big, cool, conflicted scene, like two-thirds of the way through the book. That could make a really good hook at the beginning, but you don't conclude that action. You just start with it and you get to the point where everyone's like, oh, what's going to happen next? And then you go back and you start over. And even then, that's not something I would necessarily recommend doing. But what you don't want to do is just have a bunch of scenes where it's all action and violence all the time. I've read a lot of books where it's mostly gratuitous sex or violence, almost like uncomfortable to read stuff. There's a lot of authors out there writing stuff like that, and they think they're being shocking and edgy. My books have a lot of violence in them, but only in battle scenes, only the right place. And there's also, lots and lots of slow world building scenes, because the violence and the action scenes, they don't matter at all until you care about the characters. So you've got to kind of balance them out. And each battle scene or each conflict needs to raise the stakes and be more dramatic than ever before, which is tricky. So just keep in mind that, like I mentioned before, it's melodramatic when you have characters overreacting, when people are laughing or frolicking, or like you can have fun and light scenes, just don't have flat two-dimensional characters. I didn't even get into that one, which would be cliches, but I will real quick since we're here. A cliche is like not something to avoid, because every genre has things that communicate the genre. So there are things in sci-fi books or things in fantasy novels that are common because they're cliches or tropes. So it doesn't mean you don't want to use them. You just don't want to make them flat or two-dimensional or boring. Readers read those genres for those things. So you don't want to avoid them completely, but you want to make sure there's enough depth and enough novelty in your books so that it doesn't feel like just a cookie cutter thing. The main problem with cliches is when you do something like, instead of describing what's actually different about the scene, here's another freebie I'll give you. With scene description, you always want to say the thing that's different. So instead of saying, it was a typical high school locker, or it was a typical dentist's office, or it was a typical city park, where you're not actually describing the thing, you're just telling readers to imagine what they think a typical thing looks like. That's lazy writing. You want to avoid it. It's also lazy writing to say stuff like his henchmen or his goons, they looked like, henchmen look like, or goons look like, or you just give like a flat cardboard character cutout. The goons had black clothes and whatever. Like, you refer to a body of people as one thing, which is different, but also kind of the same, where instead of describing the crowd or individual people in the crowd for details, you just kind of say, there's a big crowd, especially when you have the big crowd do unrealistic things. Like the big crowd was, laughing and pounding on the tables, and like all the people were doing all the same thing at the same time. They rejoiced and they cried. That just doesn't read as realistic, believable fiction. So be careful about making caricatures or flat examples. And when you do description, you don't want to describe what people expect. You want to focus on the things that are different, especially the things that your main characters notice are different, because that tells a lot about themselves, what they notice, and also, you know, whoever's room they're in that they're noticing. So maybe they go to somebody's house for the first time. What are they going to notice the first time they're there? Or if they've been there before and they've been there a lot, they wouldn't be noticing and commenting on things. So then it gets tricky, because they wouldn't just walk into a house they've been into a million times and just notice all of the things. But you want your description to always come from your characters, not be interjected by the author or narrator. So the way to do it is you go into a room you've been in before, but you notice something is in the wrong place, like a book that, you know, a book is off the shelf and he picks it up because now it's on the table and he reads it. Or, you know, there's empty beer bottles on the ground because the homeowner is depressed or whatever. Focus on the interesting, intriguing pieces of difference about the scene that are not expected, that communicate some information about both of the characters, the one who is seeing the stuff and the one who is responsible for the stuff. And then finally, a last point on description is characters will notice things depending on their state of mind. So if they are running through a place and they're being chased and shot at, they're not going to recognize or see most of the things. They're going to be super honed in to the thing they're looking for, which is probably like an escape or a way to get away. They're going to be looking at transportation. They're going to be looking at crowds they can disappear into. They're not going to be looking at things that don't matter to them in a crisis moment. So, you know, just know that if they're in a new place, if they're relaxed and they feel good, they might notice random stuff in great detail. But the first time when they're just running through things stressed out, especially maybe they have like a agenda, they've got a deadline, they've got to do this thing or something bad's going to happen, they're not going to be looking around at description in that moment. They're going to be too in their heads, worried about the thing. So there's a time and place for description and when to do it well and how to do it well. That's not on my list of 6, but it probably should be a 7 point. Anyway, so these are some things that I think you can work on fixing that are really common red flags for most first-time authors, but I also have a much bigger list that I put together over many years of editing lots and lots of books. So I'll link to that below as well. You can self-edit your book by going through the list and then reading your story. When you're doing your revision, don't just focus on typos and punctuation, even though that's important too. Focus on the bigger picture stuff, because the truth is, editors will not fix that for you, even if you pay them a lot of money, unless you're paying for like a ghostwriter and giving them the ability, the responsibility to really, you know, roll up their sleeves and go deep into rewriting your story. Editors, that's not what an editor is for, and ghostwriters are really expensive. So this is hard to get fixed because there's nobody you can pay to do it for you. Unfortunately, I can read through your book and point all of this stuff out, you know, and charge a lot of money for it. If that's what you want to do, it'll save you a ton of time, but you can just go through the list, which is going to be the same stuff that I would comment on your own book. And if you go through the list, it's much harder to do it yourself, but you're also going to be learning a lot more through that experience. So probably when you get into writing or publishing, you're going to need some kind of an editing software. You're going to need some kind of an editor or proofreader, and you're also probably going to need some, you know, checklists for what to actually do in a scene or what to actually do in every chapter, and how to avoid amateur weak writing. So I've put a lot of those resources together for you that I think will be useful. I hope you check those out. I've also got a book on writing that's huge and deeper than most people want, but there's a lot of good value in there as well if you want to get more serious about the craft of writing. Thanks, bye-bye.